Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about PBR textures. PBR textures, simply put, are a series of two-dimensional image textures that we wrap around an object in order to give that object extra texture information. So just to jump right into it, we're going to texture this scene. We want this object to be a damaged brick wall, and then we want it just sitting on top of a dirt ground. So we're going to look for those textures, bring them in, add them to our model, and then modify them. A really good place to find textures is a place called Polyhaven. It's full of a bunch of free assets, and they have a pretty good variety. So again, we're trying to texture this brick wall. So let's look for brick and find a good texture. I think I like this one. Let's download that. But we also want the wall to be damaged. So let's try and find some concrete. See, let's look for something that looks kind of damaged. Let's choose this one. Okay. And then the last texture we're going to look for is some sort of a ground texture. Let's look for dirt. I think I like this one. No, that's a little too... I think I like this one. Let's use this here. Okay. So we have three textures. So essentially what we need to do once we have those textures downloaded is we need to add those textures to our model. So I've already UV unwrapped my model, and so I'm going to go to the texture editor, the shader editor, and I'm going to add a new texture. Now I have Node Wrangler enabled, and again, to find that you go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and make sure that it's checked here. So with that enabled, the first thing I need to do is I need to go to my file and I need to expand these textures. Okay, those textures extracted, let's click on our principled BSDF, and if we click Control-Shift-T, we can look for those textures that we just extracted. So I'm going to start by adding this brick texture to my model, and I'm just going into these image textures and adding them to my model. And you can see it adds pretty well. Now, real quick, let's take a look at each of these maps. Again, like I said before, a PBR texture, all it is a series of image textures that are wrapped around our model in order to give our model different information. And so in order to preview a node, each of these are called nodes, I'm going to click Control-Shift-T, and I can see exactly what information this node, this base color node, is giving our object. And you can see, as base color might explain, this is telling our object where to place certain color information. And under roughness, see there's not a ton of information, but we have this really subtle brick texture. And so this is a black and white map that's telling our model where to be shiny and where to be rough. And again, black equals 0% and white equals 100%. And so since this is dictating the roughness channel, you can see that this texture is predominantly rough. There's not a lot of shine to it. Okay, now if we go to displacement, displacement tells our model where to push or sink certain pieces of our topology. And so it's saying at black, it's not going to displace the topology at all, but at white, it's going to kind of bump up the topology to make it look like the bricks are actually poking out of the wall. Now if we preview normal, normal does a really similar thing, except instead of actually moving the polygons on our model, it's acting as a sort of makeup on our model. And so it's pretending like some of these bricks are poking in and out, but it's not actually changing anything on our model. So normal's a really useful map to have if you're able to, because it doesn't drastically increase the render times of your object, but it gives a really cool effect. So now let's go back to principled BSDF. So right off the bat, you can see my bricks are probably a little bit too small. I want them to be a little bit bigger, just so the wall looks a little bit more proportionate to its surroundings. Now, there are two ways you can do that. So if we click on our wall and we come to our UV editor, we can just scale our object up or down in order to get the effect we're looking for. The problem is, if we extend our UV map beyond the boundary of our image, that's going to give us some unwanted effects down the road. So generally how you want to adjust the size of your texture is if you come back to our shader editor, we have a scale option and we're able to squish and squash our texture. but it does it in a different way than actually expanding our UV maps. So I'm going to pull in a value node just because I don't want to have to adjust each of these inputs manually. And if I plug that into scale, I can kind of scale exactly how big I want my texture to be. So I'll kind of push it to about here. Cool. Okay, let's kind of keep it here for now. There's obviously more we could do to kind of touch this up. But what I really want to show is let's add some of that concrete texture to indicate some damage to the wall. So I want some splotches of that concrete texture all around. Now all I have to do that is use a mix shader node. So if we come back to our shader editor, click on our object, one of the most powerful nodes in Blender texturing is called the mix node. And there's a mix color and a mix shader. They both do essentially the same thing, but at different levels of our texture. So real quick, I'm going to show you the mix shader node. So if we duplicate this principled BSDF, we want two shaders in our texture. And then we click on this guy and click Control-Shift-T to add another texture. I'm going to look for my concrete texture. I'm going to select all of these and load them in. Cool. Now I'm going to add what's called a mix shader node. And all I need to do is I need to plug this principled BSDF into the top shader, and then I'll add this principled BSDF to the bottom shader, and then I'm going to plug this shader node into the surface, and you see something kind of interesting happens. The brick and the concrete are kind of halfway in between each other. And if we messed with the factor, we could have this texture fully show the brick texture or fully show the concrete texture. Now we're going to keep it at 50 right now, because what's really going to, 0.5. What's really going to sell this is by using this factor node here. And this factor node uses black and white information to dictate where one texture goes versus the other. And Blender comes pre-installed with a lot of different textures. So for instance, if we added a noise texture, all that is a black and white texture, and we're going to use that in the factor node. So if we pull that factor into this factor, you can see something starting to happen. I want to increase the contrast of this black and white, so I'm going to add what's called a color ramp so that I can kind of increase the contrast between these two. You can also manipulate this texture here, so if I wanted to make these splotches bigger, I could do that. So you can get a pretty cool damaged wall effect just by using this procedural texture node. Now that leads us to a question. The noise texture allows us to create something procedural, and that's infinitely editable. However, what if I had a very specific spot that I wanted this concrete to go? For instance, I wanted a splotch right here. Now, you can use just a different node for that. So if I delete this noise texture and this color ramp, I could bring in what's called an image texture. And you'll notice this image texture is the exact same node as all of these PBR textures are using. However, instead of uploading an image, I'm going to bring the color into factor, and then I'm going to click new, and I'll name this concrete because this is masking out where we want the concrete to go. And then I'll click new image. So I'm going to go up to the texture paint tab up here, and you can see this black image is wrapped around our wall. But you can see that if I paint on this, paint a little white splotch here, and then go back to our layout panel, it's added concrete just to where we've painted. So you can be a lot more intentional with where you add that wear. So if I wanted maybe a little splotch here, and you can obviously change a lot of these effects, and so I could change this to a paint soft if I wanted a little bit more of a transition, because every color between that black and gray has a percentage value. And so those are just two different ways you can add a little bit of that complexity to a model. Again, we use an image texture, but we also used a noise texture setup with a color ramp. But there are even other textures you can use if you want something else. So if we click Shift A and go to texture, we have all of these options here. Some more useful than others that will allow us to get interesting effects. And so if I used wave texture and we just pull that in, you can see that that might not be super relevant to what we're doing, but you might be able to turn it into something kind of cool. I think I'm going to stick with my image texture, and I'm just going to modify it to kind of get splotches exactly where I want. Okay, so now that we have this kind of wall texture, let's take a look at this ground texture. And so we already know how to add textures to an object. So I'm gonna add this dirt texture, look for it. Okay, so we have this texture, but it's a little bit big. And so if we added a value node, plug that into the scale, that will assign whatever value this is to our scale. So we'll kind of bring this up. I think that's good. But you see we're presented with another problem. From this perspective, it doesn't look too bad, but if we zoom out, we have a repeating pattern that looks like Windows 95 desktop wallpaper. And that's really not what we want, because no texture in the world is going to have that repeating pattern. Now, there is a way to manipulate a PBR texture in order to remove that texturing. And it's really simple to do. And I'll try and explain what's happening as I do it to help make it make sense. In order to mix textures, we use a noise texture or an image texture. There's another texture called a Voronoi texture. So if we bring that in, preview it, you see that it has this kind of weird pockmark texture on it. Now, it also has a color channel, and this is the color channel. We're going to use this color information to randomly rotate parts of our texture. So let's kind of go back to our normal texture. Now if we plug this object input into the vector here, and then use the color channel to affect the rotation, you see what it's doing is it's essentially cutting out where these color chunks were, and it's rotating them randomly. And so we can obviously, if that's a little bit too intense, we can bring down the scale. You can also change the detail. I'm going to keep it about there, because that really removes any tiling in our entire texture. And that really is the workflow in a nutshell when it comes to texturing objects with PBR textures. Blender at its strongest uses procedural workflows to optimize PBR textures. So you see we use those PBR image textures to create everything in here, but then we use procedural noise and procedural Voronoi to manipulate those textures and get them to look exactly how we wanted them to. So I'll leave you guys there. In future videos, we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the procedural and Blender texturing workflow, but excited to see what you guys come up with, and talk to you later.